Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Labour have escalated their attack on Boris Johnson, now openly accusing him of lying over where he got the tens of thousands of pounds spent on the redecoration of his Downing Street flat. It's an accusation rejected by the Prime Minister's spokesman, who said he'd complied with all the rules and that any costs had been met by the Prime Minister personally. The row follows persistent reports that Mr Johnson said he was willing to see bodies pile high when discussing COVID strategy, something Downing Street has insisted he did not say. As our deputy political editor Vicky Young reports, it all adds up to mounting pressure on the government. And a warning, there is flash photography in Vicky's report.
Leading the country and setting the tone for the rest of government. The decisions Prime Ministers make every day in this room have far-reaching consequences for us all. They won't always be right. But criticism of Boris Johnson isn't just about his judgment, it's fast becoming about his integrity. Everywhere they go, ministers are being asked similar questions about their boss's behaviour.
Has the Prime Minister broken the rules, Mr Raab? No.
That refers to the expensive refurbishment of the flat Mr Johnson shares with his fiancée. The Prime Minister's former advisor, Dominic Cummings, says the Tory leader tried to get party donors to secretly pay for the renovations. Labour say it's time to come clean.
Who's given the loan? Who's given the money? Because we need to know who the Prime Minister, who Boris Johnson is beholden to, for who has paid for his furniture, for his sofa, for the bed that he sleeps in. And we haven't had that full and frank explanation from the Prime Minister so far. To be honest, he lied yesterday. That's not good enough.
Downing Street says Mr Johnson personally met the cost of wider refurbishment in this year, but hasn't denied that someone else originally picked up the bill. If they did, the rules say that must be made public.
The reason why we have these rules around transparency is so that the public know who decision makers, up to and including the Prime Minister, what their interests are, and to be clear that they are acting on behalf of the people, on behalf of citizens, on behalf of taxpayers, and that they're not overly influenced by donations or loans or private interests.
Number 10 insists Mr Johnson has acted in accordance with codes of conduct and electoral rules. Many Conservative MPs I've spoken to are keen to downplay the significance of all of this. One minister said Boris Johnson has a knack of getting away with things that others wouldn't. But there is concern that lots of individual, unrelated accusations could combine together and erode trust in the Prime Minister. One of the most damaging accusations Mr Johnson faces is about his views on shutting down the country because of COVID. He denies saying he'd rather see bodies pile high than approve a third lockdown. But sources told the BBC and other media organisations that he did make the remark. It's another question being fired at cabinet ministers.
I don't need to worry about who may have or didn't say what and when. The Prime Minister says he didn't say it. That's good enough for me, because actually saving lives is where it matters, and that's what this Prime Minister's done.
Mr Johnson would rather focus on campaigning ahead of next week's elections, but there are bucket loads of questions still to be answered. And Downing Street is still sidestepping many of those detailed questions about exactly how the renovations on the flat were originally paid for. And today Labour has significantly stepped up its attack. Of course, opposition parties spend a lot of time criticising governments. We're all used to that. But accusing a Prime Minister of lying is actually very rare, and that's what they've done today. They think this is an example of a pattern of behaviour, something that Downing Street completely denies. But of course, Boris Johnson will be fending off all of these questions until he answers them all.
Vicky, thank you very much.
Boris Johnson has come under renewed attack over his alleged comments about COVID deaths and also about how renovations on his Downing Street flat were paid for and by whom. Ministers once again came out in his support, insisting the Prime Minister is telling the truth. Labour, though, are accusing him of lying. And it all comes with just a little over a week until the May elections. Here's our political correspondent, Carl Dinnan.
What did he say in the supposed privacy of his office? Who paid for the renovation of his flat above Downing Street? And does anybody outside Westminster even care? Despite witnesses telling ITV News and others that a frustrated Prime Minister shouted about preferring piles of bodies to a third lockdown, ministers are backing the Prime Minister's denial.
I believe the Prime Minister. He has said no, that he didn't use those words, didn't say that. What I do know is the Prime Minister's been focused on that important balance about protecting lives and protecting livelihoods.
On the issue of the Downing Street flat, a short time ago, a Number 10 spokesperson said any costs of wider refurbishment this year, beyond those provided for by the annual allowance, have been met by the Prime Minister personally. Conservative Party funds are not being used for this. Again, ministers are sticking by their boss.
Has the Prime Minister broken the rules, Mr Raab?
No. But if, as ITV News has been told, the Tory party provided any kind of interim funds or loan for the Downing Street work, then that should be made public.
The requirement there is to declare something within 28 days of having become aware of a financial interest. So that's just an ongoing rolling process. So you'd expect that to be there by now.
But do voters care? Peterborough is in the midst of local elections. Do you think it matters how he paid for the Downing Street flat refurbishment?
I don't think it matters at all. I think he's done an incredible job. I wouldn't want to do it for all the money in the world.
Doesn't matter if he borrowed the money from a donor or paid himself.
It doesn't matter at all, no. He's doing a great job.
If you're using money, borrowing money from other sources, should know who it come from, why it come from. So, yeah, I think you should tell public.
And of course, Labour won't let it go.
People need to know what's happened here and why is the Prime Minister not coming forward with answering these very simple questions. Who paid for your flat refurbishment?
So long as voters don't mind, neither will the Prime Minister. But with the Electoral Commission and the Cabinet Secretary both investigating the funding of the flat, that could still change. Carl Dinnan, ITV News.
And our political editor Robert Peston is here. OK, few answers from the Prime Minister. Just saw the voters don't seem to care. What now?
Well, we've got elections next week. If the Tories do well, then there won't be pressure on the Prime Minister from his own party. But right now, it does look utterly chaotic. I revealed last night to you that he borrowed money from the Tory party to pay for the redecoration, refurnishing of his flat, tens of thousands of pounds. They are still refusing to say how much, how long did he borrow for. They put out, for the third time, a completely meaningless statement, which is that the Prime Minister has repaid that loan. Well, we know that, but the material question is, why did he borrow the money and why hasn't he disclosed it in keeping with the rules? And then separate from all of that, Downing Street today, on a separate explosive comment that the Prime Minister is said to have made, it was in the Times this morning, that he was going to allow the virus to rip through the population rather than have a second, yesterday we talked about a third lockdown, a second lockdown. Downing Street, on this one, refusing to deny that he said it. So it's a mess for the Prime Minister.
OK, Robert, thank you.
Now, Labour has accused Boris Johnson of lying about who paid for the refurbishment of his Downing Street flat. They're demanding a review into whether the public has been misled over how the renovations were initially paid for. Downing Street today declined to deny suggestions that the Prime Minister received a loan from the Conservative Party that he later repaid. But the use of any party funds has been previously denied by Downing Street. Our political editor Gary Gibbon has this report.
A decorator up a ladder appeared to be still at work in the Prime Minister's Downing Street flat yesterday. The redecoration costs are believed to be close to £100,000. Boris Johnson out and about campaigning yesterday for next week's elections. Today he stayed inside, away from the microphones, and questions about whether he broke the rules, trying to get Tory donors to fund the redecoration in secret. Downing Street said the Prime Minister had now paid the bill, but wouldn't answer whether he'd only just done that in the last few days in the hope of killing off the story.
The Prime Minister said that he has paid for the renovations.
Did he pay for it though, or was it kind of a third-party way in that maybe he's now paying back some of that money?
The only information that I have is that what the Prime Minister said is that he has paid for the renovations.
The British public deserve honesty from our politicians. So far, we've not had that from Boris Johnson. And if he's prepared to lie about that, what else is he prepared to lie about?
Boris Johnson is also facing persistent allegations that he said inside Number 10 that he'd rather see bodies piled high in their thousands than order a third lockdown.
I believe the Prime Minister. He has said no, that he didn't use those words, didn't say that. What I do know is the Prime Minister's been focused on that important balance about protecting lives and protecting livelihoods.
Well, I mean, who knows who to believe? This is the issue. And this is why it's a question of integrity and honesty, because you've got Boris Johnson saying one thing and others telling ITV that he definitely said this sickening, awful, callous remark.
Matt Fowler's father died of COVID, aged 56 last year.
I think that is incredibly hurtful. I think that is a complete lack of decorum and dignity on behalf of the Prime Minister. Really, somebody in his position should know better than to make comments like that.
Dominic Cummings, believed to be behind many of the allegations swirling around the Prime Minister, was attacked by the Welfare Secretary, who suggested the public may have decided they didn't trust him after his lockdown trip to Barnard Castle last year. That could risk goading Mr Cummings into more damaging leaks.
One of the things I have to decide every day is what to bother the Prime Minister with and what not to bother the Prime Minister with.
Tory MPs insist voters are much more interested in vaccines and the end of lockdown than the stories swirling around Boris Johnson at the moment. They say any sleaze effect, if it happens at all, would take a very long time. Labour, though, hopes things can happen quicker, and it's escalated its attack against Boris Johnson, calling him a barefaced liar in the hope of speeding things up. Gary Gibbon, Channel 4 News, Westminster.
Now, Labour has accused the Prime Minister of lying over the costs of the refurbishment of his Downing Street flat after Number 10 refused to clarify whether the Conservative Party loaned him money to cover the costs. The PM spokesperson also said reports that Mr Johnson had said he would rather let coronavirus rip than impose a second lockdown distort the actions of the Prime Minister, but he did not deny them. Nick Watt is here, and Nick, it does feel like this whole row is being dictated as much by what we don't actually know as by what we do.
Yeah, so Boris Johnson is currently fighting on two fronts with a sort of a grading of responses. So an absolute outright denial yesterday that he had talked about how he was prepared to see bodies pile high last autumn as the price for avoiding a third lockdown. And as you say, a slightly more equivocal response on those remarks that you quoted that were in the Times today on the second lockdown. But not exactly definitive answers from Number 10 on the cost of refurbishing his Downing Street flat and the question of who initially footed the bill. So this afternoon, a spokesperson for Number 10 said this: any costs of wider refurbishment this year beyond those provided for by the annual allowance have been met by the Prime Minister personally. Conservative Party funds are not being used for this. Now, this was issued after journalists asked the Prime Minister's spokesperson today about these remarks from March the 8th by Allegra Stratton, formerly of this parish, formerly the Prime Minister's political press secretary and now the spokesperson for COP26. She said the following: Conservative Party funds are not being used to pay for any refurbishment of the Downing Street estate. Now, what do these two statements have in common? Let's just take a look. A use of the present tense. The funds are not being used to pay for any refurbishment of the Downing Street estate. Now, what that is doing is providing linguistic space for what many Tory MPs believe happened, which is that the party initially paid the bill, the top-up bill. Boris Johnson then paid it back after he was advised of a potential conflict of interest in accepting a loan even from his own party. And then today's statement talked about how the costs have been met by the Prime Minister. Again, linguistic room for settling the bill, but not having actually paid it initially. All of that takes us to the next big moment. Look there, that's Sir Alex Allen. He stood down as the Prime Minister's independent advisor on ministers' interests after a row over the report into Priti Patel. It looks like that his successor is about to be appointed, been a big delay on all of that. And it looks like the successor has won new powers to be able to initiate inquiries. Now, that delay has meant that the register of ministers' interests hasn't been able to be updated because the new advisor has to approve that. And when we see that, that will crucially, potentially provide answers on this potential loan that was given to the Prime Minister.
Nick, briefly, we saw Cabinet colleagues coming out to support the Prime Minister. What is, though, the wider mood in the party?
Conservative Party is not a happy ship at the moment. You've got questions amongst ministers saying, why was the Prime Minister allowed to pick a fight with Dominic Cummings? Who is the heavyweight in the room? Dismay yesterday, what was regarded as a woeful performance by the young Cabinet Secretary Simon Case in front of a select committee. And one minister who knows Boris Johnson really well says the really big departure, Eddie Lister, Lord Udney Lister. He was the Prime Minister's envoy to the Gulf, but a big advisor. This is what this minister said: Eddie Lister is the big loss. All the Oxbridgey or Brexity people around Boris Johnson will go off on flights of fancy, and Eddie would bring them all back down to earth. Who on earth is going to replace him?
Interesting. Nick, thanks very much indeed. Well, I'm joined now by Labour's Shadow Community Secretary, Steve Reid. Your party's accused Boris Johnson of not telling the truth about the cost of the flat refurbishment. Do you think he's a liar, Steve?
Well, good evening, Emily. He's certainly not being honest and transparent with the British public about what's gone on here. And the reason this matters is it's about standards, integrity, respect for the rules at the very, very heart of government at number 10. But, you know, we've got this situation about who did or didn't pay for the refurbishment of the flat at number 10. But there's a pattern of behaviour here that seems to spread all the way across government. It was a year ago in the chamber of the House of Commons that I asked Robert Jenrick if we were staring into a new era of Tory sleaze when he admitted breaking the law to do favours for a billionaire Tory donor to help him dodge £40 million that was due in tax, a matter the Prime Minister refused, incidentally, to investigate. We've had the scandal with Greensill, David Cameron. We've had the issue about Matt Hancock's family shareholdings. This isn't just restricted anymore to one case. This is a pattern of behaviour across government that is actually now corroding trust in the way that government works.
Well, why are you calling for an inquiry then? Because as you mentioned, Robert Jenrick, there was an inquiry, stayed in his job. Priti Patel, there was an inquiry, stayed in her job. I think Matt Hancock was also found in breach of a judicial review. He stayed. What's the point of calling for another inquiry then? Well,
we need the inquiry because of all of those cases that you've just cited, Emily. There are a number of separate inquiries by select committees into different aspects of this. But now that this looks like something which is happening systematically across the whole of government, it is very important that it is stopped, that we shine a light on what is going on at the heart of government and understand through an independently led inquiry into ethics in government what's going on. You know, I've heard people refer to this as the government being engulfed by sleaze, but that kind of makes it sound like the government are passive victims of something that's happening to them. This is actually far more orchestrated than that. This looks to me like organised sleaze, and it's being directed from number 10 Downing Street, and the Prime Minister's refusal to open investigations into other ministers that have been caught up in this is the core of the problem.
Organised sleaze. OK, let me just ask you, and I have to say that we did ask the government to come onto Newsnight tonight. They said no. But do you believe that the ability to oversee the ministerial code, which right now lies in the hands of the Prime Minister, should be overridden? That somebody else should have the power to tell the Prime Minister his judgment is wrong about whether or not the code is broken? Somebody presumably unelected would have to do that.
I mean, my view is that we need to look at a completely different way of doing it. If the Prime Minister was able to block, as he did, investigations into questionable behaviour, illegal behaviour by Robert Jenrick, Matt Hancock, Priti Patel, who is going to police the government's behaviour? You know, it's looking like this is now a pattern of behaviour across the whole of government, and it is going to take a former director of public prosecutions to come in and clear up the organised sleaze that is increasingly becoming the hallmark of this government.
Well, he's not. I mean, do you think the Prime Minister's judgment should be overruled then? Should somebody have the power to overrule him?
The Prime Minister has shown that he cannot mark his own homework on this. The fact that we've had, you just pointed out, a vacancy as the advisor on ministerial interests has been vacant for 5 or 6 months now. That shows you just how important this matter is.
I mean, the way you're describing it, Steve, there is this litany of sleaze and the allegations. You've got questions over procurement, allegations of cronyism, the text exchange, the confusion of payment for a flat, one of the highest death tolls, if you want to go back, per capita of COVID in the world. What do they have to do for you to be gaining ground and ahead in the polls? Because it doesn't look like Labour is anywhere.
Well, I've been out knocking on doors, quite a lot since we were allowed back out. And this is increasingly something that's coming up on the doorsteps. Now, I know we're all very excited to hear the results of the local elections, but we probably are best to wait until people have actually voted. It's only just over a week away. But this issue is coming up on the doorstep, however much the Prime Minister and senior Conservative ministers might like to wish it away, because it does actually matter to the British people that there is integrity at the heart of government. And increasingly, it looks like there isn't any.
Steve Reed, thank you very much.